I remember the exact moment the air changed. Like something invisible flipped a switch and the entire yard went from quiet morning calm to a low, electric hum that settled right into my chest. The kind of sound you don't hear with your ears as much as you feel in your bones. And standing there barefoot on my back porch with a mug of black coffee going cold in my hand, I could already smell it before I saw it. That sharp chemical bite of fresh spray, paint cutting through the usual mix of wildflowers and warm cedar that always hung around my apiary. My name is Ethan Cole, and I've been keeping bees for 12 years on this half-acre stretch just outside a neat little HOA neighborhood that prides itself on trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes. And up until 2 weeks ago, my biggest problem was a late frost or a lazy queen, nothing I couldn't handle with patience and a steady hand. But that morning, the second I stepped off the porch and my boots hit the gravel, I knew something was wrong, because bees don't hum like that unless they're stressed, and stress spreads through a hive faster than wildfire through dry grass. I walked the 20 yards to my hives, the sun just barely clearing the tree line, casting that golden light that usually makes everything look peaceful. But not today, because what I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. Every single box, 4 of them, each weighing close to 100 pounds when full, was streaked in thick, glossy white paint, uneven, rushed. Like someone had gone at them in the dark without caring where it landed. And the smell hit harder up close. Chemical, aggressive, completely out of place. I crouched down, ran my fingers along the wood, still tacky, and that's when the hum spiked, not loud, but tighter, sharper, like a warning you don't ignore if you know what you're doing, and I do. I've spent years learning how bees communicate without a single word, how a slight change in scent or vibration can turn calm workers into a defensive wall in seconds. And this was agitation, not random, not natural, something triggered it. I didn't say anything, just stood there, listening, letting the pattern settle in my head while my eyes tracked every movement around the hive entrances, bees moving faster than usual, circling tighter, guard behavior ramping up. Then I caught it, a faint overspray on the ground, a trail leading back toward the fence line that separates my property from Willowbrook Estates. And just beyond that fence, like clockwork, 2 figures were already out on their morning walk, matching tennis outfits, coffee cups in hand, moving slow like they owned the entire street. Linda Harper and Deborah Klein. The kind of HOA leadership that smiles while measuring your grass with a ruler. And as Linda glanced over, just for a second, I saw it, that quick flicker of satisfaction before she turned away like she hadn't noticed anything at all. I took a slow breath, tasted the paint still hanging in the air, and that's when it clicked. Not just what they'd done, but what they'd used, because that wasn't just any spray paint. And if I was right, they hadn't just made a mess of my hives. They'd introduced a scent profile that bees interpret as a direct threat, the kind that rewires their entire response system. And standing there with 40,000 bees reacting to something they didn't understand, I realized this wasn't just vandalism anymore. This was a pattern waiting to repeat itself, and the only question left was how long it would take them to come back and do it again. I did not confront them that morning because people like Linda Harper and Deborah Klein do not respond to confrontation. They respond to control, and the second you give them a reaction, they treat it like permission to escalate. So instead, I stepped back from the hives, slow and steady, keeping my movements deliberate so the bees would read me as calm, not another threat layered on top of the chemical chaos already hanging in the air. And I let my eyes do the work while my mind started putting pieces together. 12 years around bees teaches you patterns the way a mechanic hears problems in an engine before the hood is even open. And what I was hearing now was not just agitation. It was confusion mixed with defensive alert, a very specific combination that only shows up when foreign scents interfere with their pheromone signals. And that paint, whatever brand they grabbed off a hardware store shelf, carried solvents that cut straight through the colony's communication system like static over a radio. I moved around each hive, checking the entrances, watching how the guards were reacting, noting how many were fanning versus how many were circling, and every detail confirmed the same thing. The colony was not failing. It was adapting, trying to recalibrate under stress, which meant one important thing. They were still strong, still organized, and if the disturbance repeated, the response would not stay at this level for long. I set my coffee down on the fence post and pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, but to start documenting, Slow pan across each hive, close shots of the paint, timestamps, angles that showed the proximity to the HOA fence line. Because if there is one thing I learned back when I worked inspections before I switched to full-time beekeeping, it is that evidence is not about what you know. It is about what you can prove later when it matters. The breeze shifted just enough to carry the scent again, sharper this time, and I caught another detail, a faint floral additive mixed into the paint, the kind manufacturers use to mask harsh chemicals, and that made my jaw tighten just a little, because to a bee, floral notes do not calm them down when they are layered over solvent. They confuse them. They blur the line between food signal and threat signal, which is a dangerous place for any hive to sit. I straightened up and looked back toward the fence, the white vinyl panels standing there like a clean border between two very different worlds. Mine built on understanding how nature behaves when you respect it. Theirs built on the illusion that everything can be controlled with rules and paperwork. And as I stood there, the hum behind me steady but tense, I realized something that shifted the entire situation from annoyance to strategy. This was not a one-time act. This was the beginning of a pattern, and patterns are predictable if you let them reveal themselves. I picked up my coffee again, now lukewarm and bitter, and took a slow sip while my eyes tracked the quiet street beyond the fence where Linda and Deborah had disappeared, already imagining the next time they would walk over, already convinced they were enforcing some kind of standard, already planning their next move without understanding the system they were interfering with. And that was the moment I made my decision, not to stop them, not yet, but to watch, to measure, and to let them show me exactly how far they were willing to go, because sometimes the strongest move is not to react at all. It is to let someone else keep pulling on a thread until the whole thing unravels on its own. By the second day, the smell had settled into the wood like a bad memory that refused to leave, faint but persistent, and the bees had adjusted just enough to function without calming down completely, which told me everything I needed to know about how resilient they were and how dangerous this situation could become if it kept repeating. So I did what I always do when something does not add up. I went to the source, not to confront, but to observe, and that meant walking the perimeter along that white vinyl fence until I found the one loose panel I had noticed months ago, but never bothered to fix, just enough of a gap to see through without being seen. And from there, I had a clear line of sight into the perfectly trimmed backyard of Linda Harper, where everything looked staged, not lived in, like a catalog version of suburban life, chairs aligned, flowers arranged, nothing out of place, except for the small detail sitting on her patio table, 2 spray paint cans, same glossy white finish, caps off, still resting where they had been left like tools after a job well done. I stayed there longer than I probably should have, listening to the quiet contrast between my side of the fence and hers, my side alive with movement and sound, hers controlled and still, until the back door slid open and Deborah Klein stepped out, phone in hand, voice sharp even at a distance, talking about compliance, about visual standards, about how certain elements in the neighborhood were bringing property values down, and I did not need to hear every word to understand exactly who she was talking about, because people like Deborah do not hide their intentions. They wrap them in polite language and call it community improvement. A few minutes later, Linda joined her, same confident posture, same controlled tone, and when she gestured toward my side of the fence, I saw it again, that same satisfaction from the morning before, like this was not just enforcement, it was personal. And that confirmed the second piece of the pattern. This was not random. This was deliberate, repeated, and justified in their minds. I eased back from the fence and walked toward my workshop, gravel crunching under my boots in a rhythm I have followed for years, steady, predictable, grounding. And once inside, I pulled out a notepad I used back when I worked inspections, the kind where details matter more than opinions, and I started writing everything down: time, weather, wind direction, type of paint, behavioral changes in the hive. Because when you deal with systems, whether it is infrastructure or living colonies, patterns only reveal themselves when you track them without emotion. I flipped to a fresh page and wrote one line across the top, simple and clear: repeated exposure, escalating response. And under it I listed what I knew so far: solvent-based paint, artificial floral masking, proximity to hive entrances. And then I paused, pen hovering for a second as another thought settled in. Something that shifted this from irritation into something much more calculated. Because if they believed they were fixing a problem, they would not stop. They would return, probably during daylight, probably thinking visibility made it legitimate. And if they returned with the same materials, the same method, the same lack of understanding, then the bees would not react the same way twice. Because bees learn fast, collectively, and once a colony associates a specific scent with threat, the threshold for response drops every time that scent reappears. I set the pen down and looked out the workshop window toward the hives, the afternoon sun catching the edges of the boxes, the faint hum still present, but more focused now, like tension coiled just under the surface, and I felt that familiar shift in my chest. Not anger, not frustration, but clarity, the kind that comes when you realize you do not need to force an outcome. You just need to let the right conditions exist long enough for the outcome to arrive on its own. And for the first time since that morning, I was not thinking about stopping Linda Harper and Deborah Klein. I was thinking about what would happen when they decided to continue. The third morning came quieter, the kind of stillness that makes every small sound stand out. And I was already awake before the sun cleared the trees, sitting at my kitchen table with the window cracked just enough to let the cool air carry in the low hum from the yard. Steady now, controlled, like the colony had settled into a new baseline after the first disruption, but not relaxed, never relaxed. And that distinction mattered more than anything else because calm bees tolerate, while alert. Bees remember. I stepped outside with a fresh cup of coffee, the gravel cold under my boots, and walked the same path I had taken the past 2 days, slow, deliberate, letting my presence register with the hives before I got too close. And this time the reaction was immediate, not aggressive, but tighter, more focused, guard bees shifting position faster, wings moving in short bursts that pushed scent outward like a signal flare. And I could still pick up traces of that paint, even after 48 hours, which told me just how deeply it had embedded itself into the wood grain, and more importantly, how long the colony would associate that smell with a threat. I made a small adjustment to one of the hive stands. Nothing major, just enough to check stability and keep everything balanced, because the last thing I needed was a physical issue layered on top of a behavioral one. And as I worked, I kept my ears tuned to the subtle changes in pitch and rhythm, the kind of details most people miss, but that tell you exactly where a hive stands emotionally, if you can call it that. And right now they were holding a line, not breaking, but not forgiving either. I finished up and stepped back just as the faint crunch of footsteps carried over from the other side of the fence, soft at first, then clearer, accompanied by the low murmur of voices that did not belong to my side of the property. And I did not need to look to know exactly who it was, but I did anyway. Slow turn of the head, eyes catching the movement through the gap in the panels. Linda Harper and Deborah Klein again. Same routine, same confidence, except this time they were not just walking. They were carrying something, a small plastic bag swinging lightly between them. And when Deborah pulled one of the spray cans free, the metallic rattle of the ball inside echoed faintly through the quiet morning, a sound that felt out of place in a space that usually ran on natural rhythms. I did not move, did not call out, just watched from where I stood as they approached the fence line. Their voices clearer now, talking about complaints, about visual consistency, about how they had given me enough time to correct the issue. And that word hung there for a second. Issue, like my hives were some kind of defect instead of a living system older than any set of HOA guidelines they could print. Linda leaned slightly toward the fence, peering through the gap, with that same measured look, calculating. And for a brief moment our eyes almost met, but not quite. And she turned back to Deborah with a small nod that said more than words ever could. And then came the sound, that sharp hiss of pressurized paint hitting wood again, cutting through the morning like a line being drawn, and the effect was immediate, the hum behind me tightening into something more concentrated, not louder, but denser, like the air itself was filling with intent. I stayed exactly where I was, every instinct telling me to step in, to stop it, to break the pattern before it went further, but the part of me that understood systems, that had spent years watching how cause and effect play out when left uninterrupted, held me still, because this was the repetition I had been waiting for, the confirmation that this was not a one-time mistake, but a deliberate action they believed they had the right to continue. And as the scent drifted over the hives again, stronger this time, layered on top of what was already there. I felt that same clarity settle in deeper than before, not emotional, not reactive, just precise. Because now I knew exactly what would happen next if nothing changed, and for the first time, I chose not to change it. The sound of that second spray did not fade the way it had the first time. It lingered, thicker, heavier, like the air itself had learned to carry it farther, and I could feel the shift behind me before I even turned around. That hum tightening into something more deliberate, more organized, not chaotic but focused, like a system locking onto a signal it had already identified as a problem. And I stayed exactly where I was, hands relaxed at my sides, breathing slow and even, because the last thing you ever do around bees in a heightened state is introduce sudden movement. You let them read you first. You let them decide you are not part of the equation. And over the years that patience had become second nature to me. The hiss of the spray stopped on the other side of the fence, followed by the faint click of a cap snapping back into place. And then the voices again, lighter now, satisfied. Like they had just checked off another item on a list that only existed in their version of reality. And for a moment, everything went still, that kind of silence that only happens right before something shifts. And then the hum changed, not louder, but sharper, like a frequency tightening into a point. I took one step back, slow, deliberate, creating space without breaking the line of calm I had already established, and watched as the guard bees adjusted again. Their flight paths no longer wide and exploratory but shorter, more direct, circling tighter around the hive entrances, mapping the scent in the air, recalibrating faster than they had the day before, because this was no longer new to them. This was familiar, and familiar threats do not get the benefit of hesitation. I did not need to see what was happening on the other side of the fence to understand the sequence unfolding. The pattern was already clear in my head. Repeated exposure, reduced tolerance, accelerated response. And every variable was lining up exactly the way I had written it down the night before, not because I forced it, but because that is how systems behave when left to run their course. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone again, angling it just enough to capture the hives, the fence line, the morning light cutting across both, because documentation is not just about proof, it is about timing, showing not just what happened, but when and how it unfolded. And as I recorded, the air carried a new layer of sound from beyond the fence, a sudden shift in tone, not panic, not yet, but confusion, voices rising just a fraction, footsteps changing pace, and I could picture it without looking. The moment when expectation does not match reality, when control slips just enough for uncertainty to take its place. I lowered the phone slightly, keeping my focus on the hives, because that is where the real story was, thousands of small decisions happening all at once, each bee reacting to signals layered on top of each other, scent, movement, vibration, all feeding into a collective response that did not care about property lines or HOA guidelines, only about protecting what mattered to them. And standing there, watching it unfold without interference, I felt that same clarity settle in even deeper, because now it was no longer a question of if the pattern would repeat. It was a question of how far it would go before it resolved itself. The breeze shifted again, carrying the scent back toward the fence, and the voices on the other side adjusted with it, sharper, now, less certain, and I took another slow step back, giving the space what it needed to finish the process it had already started, knowing that every second I did nothing was another second the system was documenting itself far better than I ever could. And for the first time since this began, I was not thinking about them at all. I was thinking about the outcome that was already in motion, unfolding exactly the way it was supposed to. By late afternoon, the yard had settled again, at least on the surface, but there was a difference now that you could not see unless you knew what to look for, the kind of subtle shift that lives in timing and distance rather than volume. And as I stood near the edge of the apiary with the sun dipping low behind the trees, I watched the flight patterns tighten into something more efficient, more deliberate, like the colony had updated its internal map and was no longer reacting blindly, but responding with purpose. The scent was still there, layered into the wood and drifting just enough with every passing breeze to keep the signal alive. And that meant the memory stayed active too, not fading, not resetting, just waiting for the next trigger to confirm what it had already learned. I walked the perimeter one more time, slow and steady, checking each hive, not touching more than necessary, just observing, and every detail lined up with what I expected. Guard presence slightly elevated, worker traffic consistent but alert, no collapse, no panic, just a system holding tension like a coiled spring that had not decided whether to release yet. Back inside the workshop, I set my phone on the bench and reviewed the footage, the timestamps, the angles, the clear sequence of events from first contact to repeated exposure, and I could already see how it would read to anyone who understood even the basics of environmental disturbance, cause leading directly to effect with no interference from my side. Just a clean chain of actions and reactions that told its own story without needing explanation. I pulled open a drawer and took out a printed copy of the county guidelines I had kept from my inspection days, the section on managed pollinators highlighted from years ago when I first started this place, and I read it again slowly, not because I did not remember it, but because clarity matters when you are about to let something play out, language about interference, about intentional disturbance, about liability tied not to ownership but to action, and as the words settled in, I felt that same steady certainty lock into place. Because this was no longer just about bees or property lines, it was about documentation meeting. Behavior in a way that left no room for interpretation. Outside, the evening air cooled just enough to carry sound differently, and from beyond the fence I caught fragments of conversation again, not as confident as before, shorter, clipped, like something had shifted in their understanding even if they could not name it yet. And I did not step closer this time, did not need to see them to know the pattern was still in motion, because once people convince themselves they are right, they rarely stop at the first sign of resistance. They push again, harder, expecting the world to adjust to them. I leaned against the doorframe of the workshop and looked out over the hives, the last light catching the edges of the boxes now marked with those uneven white streaks. And for a moment, everything felt still, balanced on that thin line between action and consequence. And I knew exactly where I stood in it, not as someone about to intervene, but as someone who had already set the conditions and was now waiting for the system to complete itself, because I had seen this kind of sequence before in a different context, different materials, different stakes, but the same underlying truth. When you introduce the wrong variable into a stable system and keep repeating it, the system does not break immediately. It adapts, it learns, and then, at a certain point, it responds in a way you cannot control anymore. I took one last look at the fence, quiet now, no movement, no voices, just that clean white barrier separating two very different understandings of how the world works. And I turned back toward the house knowing that the next move would not be mine, it would be theirs, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The next morning started before sunrise, the sky still holding that deep blue just before the light breaks, and I was already outside with my jacket half zipped, standing about 30 feet from the hives with my phone mounted low against the fence post where it could see everything without drawing attention. Because timing matters more than position when you are letting something unfold, and the air felt different again, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with anticipation, like the yard itself was waiting. The hum was there, steady but coiled, not loud, not chaotic, just focused. Like every bee already knew where its boundaries were and what crossed them, and I could still pick up that layered scent in the breeze, faint but persistent, a chemical note that did not belong, and that was all it would take. I checked the angle on the camera one more time, making sure the hives, the fence gap, and the approach path from the HOA side were all in frame, then stepped back into the shadow of the workshop, not hiding, just removing myself from the center of the equation, because this was never about me stepping in. It was about what happened when I did not. It took about 20 minutes before I heard it, that familiar rhythm of footsteps on the other side of the fence, lighter at first, then more confident as they got closer, and when I glanced through the narrow gap I saw them again. Linda Harper leading, Deborah Klein just behind her, same outfits, same posture, same sense of certainty that nothing on this side of the fence could push back in a way they did not control. And in Linda's hand, the same white can, catching the early light just enough to flash for a second before she shook it. That sharp metallic rattle carrying clean through the still morning air. They did not hesitate this time. No pause, no discussion, just a quick glance at the hives, and then that same forward lean as Linda angled the nozzle through the gap. And the second that first press released that thin stream into the air, everything shifted at once, Not explosively, not dramatically, but instantly, like a switch being flipped in a system that had been waiting for the exact same input twice before deciding what it meant. The hum behind me tightened into a denser vibration, not louder, but more concentrated, and the flight paths changed in a way that only happens when recognition kicks in, shorter arcs, faster adjustments, a collective movement that stopped testing and started responding, and I could hear it carry across the fence too. That subtle change that most people would miss. But not them this time, because their voices cut through. It a second later, not calm anymore, not measured, just edged with something unfamiliar, hesitation layered over confusion. I did not move, did not step forward, just kept my eyes on the hives and let the camera capture the rest, because this was the moment the pattern completed itself, repeated exposure meeting learned response with no interruption, and on the other side of that fence, control was no longer part of the equation the way they thought it was. The spray stopped abruptly, the rattle of the can shifting as Deborah said something I could not make out. Faster now, and the footsteps changed again. No longer slow and deliberate, but uneven, retreating without the same confidence they had arrived with, and the space between the fence and the hives filled with that charged stillness that only shows up after a system has reacted exactly the way it was designed to. I let a few seconds pass before stepping forward, just enough to check the edges of the apiary. Not interfering, just confirming what I already knew, that the colony was intact, organized, responding within its own boundaries. And as I glanced back toward the fence, now quiet again, no movement, no voices, just that clean white line separating their side from mine. I felt that clarity settle in one final time, because this was no longer a question of what might happen. It had already happened, exactly the way it was always going to. By mid-morning, the neighborhood had shifted in a way you could not measure with a ruler or write into a rulebook, the kind of quiet tension that spreads without anyone announcing it. And I noticed it first in the way the street beyond the fence did not sound the same anymore. Fewer casual footsteps, fewer idle conversations. Like something had interrupted the routine just enough to make people pause and reconsider what they thought they understood about this side of the property. I stood near the hives with the sun fully up now, warmth settling into the wood, and the hum had changed again, not tight, not defensive, just steady and controlled, like the colony had completed its response cycle and returned to baseline, but with memory intact, always with memory. And that was the part most people never think about. Bees do not forget patterns that matter to survival. I checked the camera footage back inside. Slow and methodical, watching the sequence unfold from the moment Linda raised that can to the moment everything shifted, the angles clear, the timing precise, no gaps, no assumptions, just a clean record of cause and effect playing out exactly as expected. And as I replayed it, I paid attention not just to the hives, but to the small details on the other side of the fence, the hesitation in movement, the change in posture, the moment confidence gave way to uncertainty. Because those details tell a different story than words ever will. I saved the clips, backed them up, organized everything by timestamp, not rushing, not reacting, just preparing, the same way I used to when inspections turned into reports that someone else had to read and understand without me standing there to explain it. And once everything was in place, I stepped back outside and leaned against the fence, not looking through it this time, just listening to the quiet on the other side. Because sometimes silence carries more information than noise. It did not take long before that silence broke, a different set of footsteps this time, slower, more cautious, and voices that were not trying to sound in control anymore, lower, measured, like they were choosing their words more carefully. And when I finally glanced through the gap, I saw Linda and Deborah again. But something had shifted in the way they held themselves. The straight lines of certainty softened into something less rigid, less absolute, and there was no spray can in sight. Linda looked toward the hives, then toward the ground, then back toward Deborah, and for a moment neither of them spoke, just stood there in that narrow strip of space between intention and consequence. And I could see it settling in, not all at once, but piece by piece, the realization that what they had been trying to control did not operate on the same rules they were used to enforcing. I did not say anything, did not step forward, because there was nothing left for me to add. The system had already explained itself far better than I could, and after a few seconds that stretched longer than they probably expected, They turned and walked away without another word. No sharp movements, no confident strides, just a quiet exit that carried a different kind of weight. I stayed where I was for a while after they disappeared, listening to the steady hum behind me, the normal sounds of a place that had returned to balance on its own terms. And as the breeze moved through the yard, carrying only the faintest trace of what had been introduced days before, I knew that whatever came next would not be driven by force or reaction. It would be shaped by what had already been learned on both sides of that fence. It took less than 48 hours for the formal side of things to catch up with what had already happened in the yard, and it started the way these things usually do, not with a confrontation, but with a letter, a clean white envelope taped to my mailbox with the HOA logo stamped in the corner, like it still meant authority over anything on my side of the fence. And I could tell before I even opened it that the tone would be different this time, because when confidence breaks, it does not disappear. It reshapes itself into something more careful. I read it standing right there in the driveway, the paper crisp between my fingers, language about concerns, about safety, about a request to discuss the placement and maintenance of my hives. No mention of paint, no mention of prior actions, just a quiet attempt to rewrite the sequence as if it had started with them reaching out reasonably. And I folded it once, slow and precise, and slipped it into my back pocket without a word. Inside the workshop, I pulled up the footage again, not because I needed to see it, but because I wanted to choose exactly which parts told the story best without saying anything extra. The first morning, the second application, the third repetition where everything shifted, each clip trimmed clean to show only what mattered. No commentary, no reaction, just cause and effect laid out in order. And when I finished, I attached the files to a single email addressed not to Linda or Deborah, but to the County Environmental Office, the same department that writes the guidelines I had read the night before. Because when you let the right system handle a situation, you do not need to argue. You just need to present facts. The response came faster than I expected, not immediate, but fast enough to tell me the documentation spoke clearly on its own. A request for a brief visit, a confirmation that interference with managed pollinators falls under a different set of rules than neighborhood aesthetics. And by the next afternoon, a county vehicle rolled slowly down the street on the other side of the fence, not with lights or urgency, just quiet presence, the kind that makes people pay attention without anyone raising their voice. I stayed in the yard while the conversation happened beyond the panels, did not step closer, did not listen too hard, because I already knew what was being explained, not in my words, but in language backed by regulation, liability, and a chain of evidence that did not need interpretation. And when the vehicle pulled away, the street did not return to normal right away. It stayed quiet a little longer, like something had settled deeper than surface level. Over the next few days, the changes became visible in small ways. No more footsteps near the fence in the morning. No more voices carrying over with that sharp edge of authority. Just distance, consistent and deliberate. And one evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the yard in that same soft light from the first day, I noticed a small detail that said more than anything else. The loose fence panel had been adjusted from the other side, not repaired, just shifted enough to close the gap completely, a quiet boundary, drawn without announcement. I stood there for a moment, listening to the steady hum of the hives behind me, calm now, balanced, exactly where they should be, and I thought about how the whole thing had unfolded, not through force, not through confrontation, but through patience, observation, and letting a system respond the way it was built to respond. I never raised my voice, never crossed that fence, never touched them or their side of anything. I just let them repeat a mistake until the outcome explained itself in a way no argument ever could. And as I turned back toward the house, the last light catching those faint white streaks still visible on the wood, I understood something simple that most people miss. Control is easy to claim when everything follows your rules. But the moment you step into a system that does not recognize them, the only thing that matters is whether you understand how it actually works, and they did not until it was already too late to pretend otherwise.